Have you ever wondered if miracles still happen in this world? In the icy mountains of Montana, a lonely war veteran saves a helpless puppy after its family is killed by wolves. Years later, fate brings them face to face with the same danger, and what happens next will test the limits of love, courage, and faith. This isn't just a story about survival, it's about forgiveness, redemption, and the quiet miracle that only God can create. If this story touches your heart, please take a second to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Because sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change everything. Thank you for watching. May God bless you and your loved ones. The night had fallen heavy over the Montana wilderness, where the pines stood like black sentinels against a sea of snow. The wind howled across the valley, sharp as broken glass, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and frost. The town of Livingston lay 20 miles away, asleep under a blanket of white. Up on the ridge, a single cabin flickered with a dim light, a stubborn ember against the storm. Inside that cabin lived Jack Miller, a man molded by silence and loss. Jack was 43, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years of military service as a U.S. Marine. His face bore the rough edges of a man who'd seen too much. A deep scar traced his jawline, a reminder from Afghanistan. His eyes, a steel gray, carried the weight of memories he'd rather forget. A coarse beard covered most of his face, and his hair, streaked with early silver, was kept short out of habit. He spoke little, smiled even less, but every movement he made was deliberate. A man trained to survive, now simply existing. The cabin was his refuge, a place where time slowed. The smell of burnt coffee and oiled wood lingered in the air. Outside, the snowstorm thickened, pressing against the windows like an unwelcome guest. Jack sat by the fire, a rifle leaning against the wall beside him, his mind drifting between the crackle of flames and the ghosts of his past. Brothers in arms who never made it home. He had built this life of solitude to keep the world out. Yet on that night, fate came knocking not at his door, but from the depths of the forest. Through the storm, a faint sound pierced the wind, a desperate cry. Jack lifted his head, listening. Another cry followed, sharper, higher-pitched, the sound of pain, of fear. Then came the guttural growl of wolves. His instincts kicked in. He grabbed his coat, a thick, worn military jacket, and slung the rifle over his shoulder. Stepping into the storm, the cold bit instantly into his skin. Snow whipped across his face as he trudged through the white darkness, guided only by the sounds of struggle echoing from the trees. The deeper he went, the more the cries tore at him, until he reached a small clearing illuminated by moonlight. There, chaos unfolded. A pack of wolves, 6, maybe 7, circled something on the ground. Jack raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp crack split the silence, and the wolves scattered, melting into the tree line. What they left behind froze Jack where he stood. On the blood-stained snow lay a man, no older than 30, wearing a torn red flannel and heavy work boots. His face was pale, eyes wide open toward the sky, lifeless. Beside him, a female German shepherd, her coat thick and tan with black markings, lay gasping for air. Her fur was matted with blood, her body trembling. Between her paws, a small, whimpering puppy, barely a few weeks old. Jack dropped to his knees beside them. The man's throat bore the marks of fangs. There was nothing to be done. The woman, the dog, turned her head weakly, her amber eyes meeting his. There was no fear, only gratitude. Jack whispered, "Easy, girl. You're safe now." She blinked once, exhaled a final breath, and her head fell still. For a long moment, Jack remained motionless. The storm howled around him, but inside a strange calm settled. He wrapped the tiny puppy in his coat and carried it back to the cabin. Then he returned for the bodies. Under the pale light of dawn, Jack dug graves beside a frozen oak. One for the man, one for the mother dog. His hands bled from the frozen earth, but he didn't stop. When it was done, he fashioned 2 small wooden crosses from pine branches, marking them with his hunting knife. He stood over them silently, the puppy pressed against his chest. "You're not alone," he murmured, voice cracking from both cold and something deeper. The puppy looked up at him with wet, confused eyes. It was a small German shepherd, its fur dark and soft, its ears too large for its head. The little creature shivered, but did not cry. Jack could feel its heartbeat against his palm, fragile yet stubbornly alive. That spark stirred something long dormant inside him. Back in the cabin, he fed the pup warm milk from a tin cup, wrapping it in an old blanket. He studied the tiny animal, noticing how it instinctively nuzzled his hand, seeking warmth and safety. "You're one tough little soldier," Jack muttered. "Rex, that's what I'll call you." Days passed, and the storm finally eased. The mountains gleamed under sunlight, clean and cruel in their beauty. Jack repaired his fence, chopped wood, and checked his traps, all while Rex followed him clumsily, tripping over his own paws. The silence that once weighed on the cabin began to shift, replaced by soft barks, the patter of small feet, and a presence that reminded Jack what it meant to care again. One evening, as the firelight danced across the walls, Jack looked down at Rex curled beside his boots. The puppy was asleep, one paw twitching as if chasing something in a dream. Jack smiled faintly for the first time in years. "You and me, kid," he said softly. "We start over." Outside, the wind carried away the last traces of the storm. The forest, which had witnessed death and mercy alike, settled into silence once more. Beneath the oak on the ridge, the snow lay smooth over the graves, and somewhere deep in the woods, the distant echo of a wolf's howl faded into the cold Montana night. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the fire against his scarred hands. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. Spring came slowly to the Montana mountains, as if the land itself had forgotten how to thaw. Snow still clung to the shadows of the pines, but the river had begun to move again, a thin line of silver slicing through the white wilderness. In the small cabin by the ridge, life found a fragile rhythm. Jack Miller had settled into a new kind of routine, one built not on loneliness but on companionship. Rex, now nearly a year old, had grown from a trembling pup into a powerful German shepherd with a sleek tan and black coat, strong legs, and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. He was quick, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, a reflection of the man who raised him. Jack trained Rex the same way he once trained soldiers: patience, repetition, and quiet respect. Every morning, Jack whistled softly, and Rex would bolt out the door, circling the cabin nose to the ground. Together, they hunted rabbits, gathered wood, and checked the traps along the stream. Jack taught Rex hand signals, commands, and how to track by scent. Sometimes, when Rex brought back something small, a lost glove or a stick, Jack couldn't help but grin, his hard features softening in the warmth of those simple victories. The cabin itself had changed too. Where once it was filled with silence, it now held sound. The shuffle of paws, the jingle of a metal tag on Rex's collar, the occasional low bark that echoed like laughter. Jack repaired the porch, repainted the door, and even carved Rex's name into a wooden sign above the steps. Home of Jack and Rex. On market days, Jack rode into town to trade furs and buy supplies. It was on one of those trips that Sarah Whitman, the storekeeper, noticed him again. Sarah was in her late 30s, slender and tall, with light brown hair always tied in a neat braid and freckles scattered across her sun-warmed face. She had run the general store since her husband died in a logging accident 3 years before. Despite her losses, there was a quiet strength in her, the kind that comes from surviving pain without bitterness. "Morning, Jack," she said as he stepped inside, shaking the snow from his boots. Her voice carried warmth, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Rex, who sat obediently by the door. "That your partner?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, found him last winter. We've been together since." Sarah smiled, reaching for a can of coffee from the shelf. "He looks like a good boy, smarter than half the men who walk in here." Jack chuckled under his breath, a sound she hadn't heard from him before. "He's the reason the cabin doesn't feel so empty." There was something about the way Sarah listened, patient, kind, that eased Jack's guarded nature. She reminded him of people he'd lost, of home, of gentler days before the war carved walls inside him. Before leaving, she tucked a small bag of jerky into his supplies. "For your soldier, there," she said. Jack hesitated, then nodded in gratitude. Back at the cabin, life carried on in quiet simplicity. Rex learned to fetch tools, to patrol the property, even to alert Jack with a low growl when deer wandered too close at night. Sometimes, Jack would sit by the fire, polishing his old service badge while Rex slept by his boots. He kept a faded photograph on the mantel, his Marine unit in Afghanistan. The faces were young, sunburned, full of laughter. His best friend, Corporal Dean Harper, was there too, arm slung over Jack's shoulder. Dean had been the kind of man who made everyone believe they'd survive anything. But one dusty morning in Kandahar, Dean didn't. The blast that killed him left Jack with the scar on his jaw, and the silence that followed him home. One night, unable to sleep, Jack stared at the photo and whispered, "You were right, Dean. It's not the fighting that kills you. It's the coming back." He looked down at Rex, who lifted his head and pressed it against Jack's leg as if he understood. Jack smiled faintly. "You're the reason I'm still here, boy." Outside, the world was still wild, but within the small circle of that cabin, there was peace. The stars hung low over the ridge, the fire crackled softly, and the man and his dog, two broken souls stitched together by fate, found comfort in the quiet rhythm of their shared existence. Winter returned to the mountains like a familiar enemy, silent, merciless, and patient. The air turned sharp enough to cut skin, and the river that once sang beside Jack's cabin froze into glass. Snow piled high against the door, muting every sound except the whisper of the wind. Jack Miller had seen many winters, both in battlefields and in these wild woods, but this one felt different. Heavier, as if something unseen was watching from beyond the tree line. Rex, now 2 years old, had grown into his prime. A large German shepherd with a proud stance, a powerful chest, and eyes that burned with alertness. He was no longer the timid pup who once shivered in Jack's arms. He was a guardian, a soldier reborn in fur. The quiet of the forest began to break with troubling news. When Jack rode into town one morning, The general store was filled with anxious talk. Ranchers spoke of missing livestock, of carcasses torn apart, and trails leading back into the woods. Tom Bennett, a stocky rancher in his 50s with a thick mustache and frostbitten fingers, slammed his hat on the counter. "It's those wolves again," he growled. "A big one leads 'em. Scar over its eye, just like the devil himself." Jack froze. His mind flashed back to that night 2 winters ago. The blood, the snow, the dying mother dog. The image of that scarred wolf burned behind his eyes. Sarah, who stood behind the counter, noticed the change in his expression. "Jack," she said softly, "maybe it's time to stay in. Let the wildlife officers handle it." But Jack only shook his head. "This is my ridge, Sarah. If the pack's back, they'll come for us next." That evening, Jack returned home under a dim red sunset, the sky bruised with storm clouds. Rex trotted beside him, tense, ears twitching at every rustle. The air carried a scent, faint but unmistakable. Jack crouched and brushed the snow near the stream. Fresh tracks, large, deep wolf prints. He followed them for 100 yards until he found the remains of a deer, torn and scattered. Rex growled low in his throat, teeth bared, hackles raised. Jack knelt beside him, scanning the trees. The snow muffled everything, yet he felt it, that same weight of danger pressing against his spine. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We'll handle this." That night, the storm came. The cabin shook under the wind, snow rattling against the windows like pebbles. Jack sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, while Rex paced back and forth, restless. The old wooden clock ticked loudly, each second stretching thin. Then, sometime past midnight, Rex stiffened. His head snapped toward the window, ears pricked. A moment later, Jack heard it too, a faint crunch of snow. Then another. Then a howl, long, low, close. He moved to the window, rifle in hand. Through the fogged glass, he saw movement, shadows gliding between the trees, at least half a dozen. The wolves had come. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the firelight like shards of amber. Rex growled, a deep sound that rumbled from his chest. Jack laid a hand on his back, feeling the muscle quiver beneath the fur. "They're testing us," he murmured. He lit the lantern, dimmed the fire, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he circled the cabin, checking the traps he had set earlier. Iron jaws half buried beneath snow, baited with frozen meat. Rex followed, moving in perfect rhythm beside him. When a shape darted near the tree line, Jack fired a warning shot. The echo rolled down the valley. The wolves vanished into the dark, but their howls lingered, circling, taunting. Hours passed before silence returned. Inside, Jack bolted the door and fed another log to the fire. Rex lay at his feet but didn't sleep, his eyes never leaving the window. Jack stared into the flames, mind racing. He knew this wasn't random. Wolves didn't attack this close to human scent unless driven or led. And there was only one leader that could bring them back here: the scarred wolf. He reached for the photograph on the mantel. His unit again. The faces of men who'd stood beside him through worse nights. He whispered, almost to himself, "Guess we're going to war again, huh?" Rex lifted his head, ears twitching as if he understood. By morning, the storm had eased, leaving the world washed in white silence. Jack opened the door and looked out. Beyond the porch, the snow was marked with fresh prints, dozens of them, circling the cabin like ghosts of the past. He clenched his jaw. The wolves had been closer than he'd thought. He turned to Rex. "It's them," he said quietly. and they'll be back." The dog growled softly, his tail stiff, eyes burning with the same fury Jack felt. Somewhere deep in those woods, the scarred wolf waited, and both man and dog knew that the peace they had built was about to be tested. The storm rolled in from the north like a beast unleashed. The wind screamed through the pines, tearing at the cabin's roof, flinging shards of ice against the window panes. Snow came sideways, thick and blinding, swallowing the world in white. Jack Miller stood by the door, rifle in hand, the firelight flickering across his hardened face. Rex prowled beside him, muscles tense, his breath fogging the cold air. Both man and dog could sense it. The forest was alive tonight, crawling with danger. Outside, the howls began. First one, then several more, rising and falling like a grim chorus echoing through the storm. Jack's pulse quickened. He checked the traps again, every movement efficient, practiced. Years of combat had trained him to think clearly under pressure. But this was no war with men. This was primal. It was survival. The first shadow moved near the tree line. Jack raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the storm, followed by a brief yelp and silence. But then, dozens of shapes appeared. Wolves, their coats gray and silver against the snow, their eyes burning yellow. At their front, towering above the rest, was the alpha, the scarred wolf. The beast's fur was matted and dark, and a deep white scar carved diagonally across its left eye. Its gaze locked with Rex's, and something ancient passed between them. Hatred, recognition, vengeance. Jack fired again, dropping one wolf, but more poured from the dark. They fanned out, circling the cabin. Rex snarled, leaping into the snow. Jack shouted, "Rex, stay close!" But the wind tore his voice away. The wolves lunged, and chaos exploded. Jack swung the rifle like a club, striking one off his leg, then fired into another's chest. He moved with grim precision, but the numbers were overwhelming. One wolf caught his arm, teeth sinking through his coat. He slammed the butt of the gun into its skull, blood spraying onto the snow. Pain burned through his shoulder. Through the storm, he saw Rex, a blur of motion and fury. The German shepherd collided with the scarred alpha, their bodies rolling through the snow in a blur of teeth and fur. The alpha bit deep into Rex's flank, but Rex twisted free, slamming the wolf to the ground. The two beasts faced each other again, panting, blood staining the snow beneath them. Jack tried to reach them, but another wolf lunged at him, knocking him backward into the snow. His rifle slipped from his grasp. He grabbed his knife and plunged it upward, feeling it sink into flesh. The wolf collapsed over him, heavy and limp. Jack pushed it aside, coughing, snow clinging to his beard. His right shoulder throbbed with pain, dislocated, maybe worse. But when he looked up, all he saw was Rex and the alpha locked in their deadly dance. Rex lunged, teeth snapping for the throat. The alpha dodged, striking with brutal speed, claws raking Rex's side. Rex stumbled, growling low, then sprang again, this time faster, more desperate. He caught the alpha by the neck, and both animals went down hard. Snow flew in all directions as they struggled, snarling, the sound raw and primal. Jack tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. "Rex!" he shouted hoarsely. For a long moment, everything seemed frozen. Two creatures tangled in fury, man helpless to intervene. Then, with one final savage motion, Rex clamped down, his jaws crushing the alpha's throat. The wolf convulsed once, then fell still. The remaining wolves howled in confusion, then scattered into the blizzard, disappearing into the endless white. Silence returned, broken only by the wind. Jack stumbled forward, falling to his knees beside Rex. The dog lay still for a moment, chest heaving, blood streaking his fur. Jack pressed his hand against the wound, his breath trembling. "Easy, boy. You did it. You did it." Rex opened his eyes weakly, tail flicking once against the snow. Jack tore a strip from his coat, wrapping it around his shoulder, then another for Rex's wound. The pain in his arm was sharp, but he barely felt it. The storm began to fade, the wind easing into a low whisper. Jack looked toward the lifeless shape of the scarred wolf lying a few feet away, its eye open and glassy. The scar across its face glowed pale under the moonlight. Jack exhaled, long and heavy. It's over. He lifted Rex into his arms, staggering back toward the cabin through knee-deep snow. The door slammed behind them, and he laid the dog near the fire. Rex whined softly, but licked Jack's hand before closing his eyes. Jack sank beside him, exhaustion flooding his body. The rifle leaned against the wall, the firelight dancing over the room, casting long shadows that trembled like ghosts. Outside, the blizzard eased into calm, the first light of dawn breaking faintly beyond the ridge. The battle was won, but the quiet that followed carried something deeper, not victory, but release. The storm had finally passed. Morning light crept slowly over the ridge, washing the world in hues of pale gold and blue. The mountains of Montana stood silent, draped in snow that sparkled under the first touch of the sun. Smoke rose weakly from the cabin chimney, curling into the crisp air. Inside, the room smelled of burnt wood and blood, the aftermath of survival. Jack Miller sat near the fire, his left shoulder wrapped tightly in a bandage fashioned from torn fabric. His face was pale, lips cracked, and the beard along his jawline was matted with frost. Despite the pain, there was calm in his expression, a kind of quiet that only comes after the storm. Beside him lay Rex, the German shepherd, his flank stitched roughly with thread, the fur around the wound shaved and smeared with antiseptic. He was breathing slowly but evenly, one paw twitching occasionally, as if still fighting ghosts in his dreams. Jack reached out, his rough hand resting gently on Rex's head. "You did good, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse but tender. "We made it." The dog stirred, opened his amber eyes, and pressed his nose into Jack's palm. For a long moment, neither moved. Outside, the light grew brighter, filtering through the frosted windows like a promise. As the day unfolded, Jack forced himself to his feet, wincing at the pain in his arm. He limped to the door and opened it. The snow outside was untouched, pristine again, except for a dark patch where the wolves had fallen the night before. The bodies were gone, dragged away by scavengers or buried by the storm. All that remained were faint trails leading into the forest. Jack exhaled, breath misting in the cold air. "It's over," he whispered. Later that afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats approached. Jack looked up and saw Sheriff Alan Briggs riding through the snow. The sheriff was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face framed by a gray mustache and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Years of dealing with both men and nature had made him cautious, but fair. He dismounted slowly, his heavy coat dusted with frost. "Heard the wolves hit your ridge last night," Briggs said, his voice deep and steady. "You all right?" Jack nodded. "We're alive. That's enough." The sheriff glanced at Rex, who struggled to stand, tail wagging weakly. "Damn fine dog you've got there," Briggs said softly. "There's talk in town you took down the alpha. Folks will sleep easier." Jack gave a faint smile. "We just defended what's ours." Briggs studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and handed over a small cloth bag. "Sarah sent this. Said you might need it." Inside was a tin of salve, a loaf of bread, and a handwritten note. "For you and Rex. Stay warm." Jack's fingers lingered on the paper, and for the first time in days, warmth that wasn't from fire filled his chest. "Tell her thank you," he said quietly. The sheriff nodded, then climbed back onto his horse. "You did good, Jack. Not many would have stood their ground up here alone." Jack watched him ride away until the figure disappeared beyond the trees. Then he looked back at Rex, who was now sitting upright by the fire, head tilted, ears alert. "You hear that?" Jack said with a soft laugh. "They're calling us heroes. You believe that?" Rex wagged his tail once, then let out a short bark, as if agreeing. As evening fell, the light softened into gold again, touching the world with gentleness after so much violence. Jack put on his coat and stepped outside with Rex following close behind. The air was still and pure, the snow crunching beneath their boots and paws. They walked up the ridge to the place beneath the oak where 2 wooden crosses stood, the graves of the fallen man and the mother dog from 2 winters ago. Jack knelt in the snow, brushing it away from the markers. Rex sat beside him, staring silently at the graves. His ears twitched, and after a moment, he lifted his head and barked once, a sharp, clear sound that echoed through the forest and faded into the mountains. Jack looked at him, eyes soft. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They can rest now." He placed his gloved hand on the nearest cross and closed his eyes for a moment. The words came out barely audible. Maybe that's what all this was for. To let go. As the sun dipped below the ridge, the last light of day reflected on the snow, painting everything in warm gold. Jack turned to Rex. "We've ended the past, haven't we, buddy?" The dog barked softly again, tail sweeping the snow. Jack smiled faintly. Maybe the real miracle isn't surviving. Maybe it's learning to forgive. Together they sat there as twilight settled, man and dog framed against the vast white world. Snow began to fall again, gentle and silent, covering the scars of the land. The last image was of Rex lying peacefully beside his mother's grave, eyes half closed, while Jack watched over him, the fire from the cabin flickering faintly behind them, a symbol that life, however scarred, still carried warmth. In the soft light of dawn, when Jack whispered, "Maybe the real miracle is learning to forgive," the story revealed its heart. The miracle wasn't in defeating the wolves or surviving the storm. It was in finding peace after pain, in realizing that healing begins when we choose compassion over hatred. Just as Jack and Rex let go of their anger, we too are called to release the burdens of our past. This story reminds us that God's greatest miracles often come quietly, not as thunder or lightning, but as forgiveness, grace, and the courage to love again after loss. Sometimes, the battles we face are not against others, but within ourselves. And when we forgive, we let light back into our lives, just as the morning sun broke through the Montana snow. May God bless you, wherever you are watching from, with peace, strength, and the wisdom to forgive those who have hurt you. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about what part of the story moved you most. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming, faith-filled stories. May the Lord watch over you and your loved ones, today and always.